like to change the order of my talk. Just to jump around a little bit. Around 2014, 15, 16, we said the obvious thing is like, well, why don't we just put sound in these lights? That would be amazing. Like, let's like blow this open and see if we can do audio in the same way that we're thinking about light. Like fill spaces have hundreds of points of audio, and this was immediately put into action by Squid Soup, who started making Arduino powered audio and light objects. So all of these are actually light bulbs, basically, that you put the top on. And their first work, 2016, in Kew Gardens in London, was Bloom, and they were controlling 1,000 lights with sound. But the sound was very, very simple. It was, in fact, I don't even know if I've got sound on this one, but it was just, these are actually just piezo, so buzzer speakers, basically, not full definition speakers. And needless to say, this was an astonishingly difficult technical project to implement. They actually put GPS units in each of the things so that they could position them, which was expensive and error prone. But that seeded what we started to do. Then they developed a couple more iterations. This was the project Wave. So in this project, they moved on to proper speakers with PCM audio playback capabilities. And this was at Salisbury Cathedral, famous now for the poisoning of a Russian agent in Salisbury. So they invested money in getting tourists to come back because they were afraid of poison. And you can see that they kind of had developed this into these nice, neat globes, same globes. Of course, audio really doesn't work if you enclose the speaker inside a ball. So this was great, but it was dead quiet. But we could do audio sample playback. And then the next iteration was at the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Arizona, and they developed their design so that the speaker pops out of the globe. So massive breakthrough and some improvements to the software. And that's what they're getting custom-made Arduino still boards. And this is what it looks and sounds like. So this was a massive success, really worked amazingly well. Where is my survey? Here we go. We did very, so the limitations, there's some birds. And drones that play different chords. I'll just mute that again. This is still massively limited. It's limited to loading up samples and playing them back. Just basically indexing them, samples number 1 to 100, choosing which ones to play. So you've got to do a lot of prep work. And the kinds of things, again, I'm sure you can imagine, like stupid amounts of technical mucking around with Wi-Fi. This is right next to a giant hospital. So they had like a really high power Wi-Fi system with multiple access points, and they had to regulate that because they didn't want to disrupt the hospital. All kinds of mad problems managing the tech. And one of those things is, these things are like basically samplers or synthesizers. You load them up with sounds, and then they'll play back sounds. So you want to make sure the sounds are preloaded onto the devices. When you're trying to do creative development on site with everything installed, you can copy sounds over Wi-Fi, but that's very slow, very painful, and very risky. Oh, and I just cut it off, but it was wrapped around a James Turrell installation, which was particularly beautiful because Ant, who runs Squid Soup, absolutely worships James Turrell. So he had a piece wrapping around a James Turrell. And just one other video. This is just to show some of the sound experimentation. You might be able to hear that. And all I'm playing that for is just to show, like, we were doing live experimentation on site because it was the only way we could actually do the aesthetic fine tuning. And this is one of the things I'm super interested in these projects, is the creative process when you've got very limited time to do, say, creative fine tuning and massive technical constraints. That example of the sound I just played was one that we didn't end up using, just limited time, but it was one of my favorite sounds because it was kind of white noise, but I actually made it from getting audience, like crowd noises and river noises and generated white noise, and just made this blend of white noises and made it fly through the space. And it had, just because you get that high-pitched tingling, it's just very, very beautiful when you hear that in space. You really hear this sort of thing rushing past. Sort of sounds like roller skates or something. And then I had to put this in. I just had to put this in because this was actually something that John and I mocked up years ago. And never exhibited, but my comment, play a little bit of sound. I'll have to just move quickly because I'm going through stuff really fast. But that was John's work using Firefly dynamics, and I did a generative sound piece that took the signals from his piece and massive multiples of sound. We had, like, hundreds of sound players all being triggered by movement, and that limitation with the Squid Soup work, just being able to play back individual samples, I just found incredibly constraining. So my drive to push this forward has been to do proper real-time audio synthesis, dynamic stuff. Like if you've ever used Max or Super Collider, then that kind of level of audio synthesis on devices. And parallel to all of that work, I actually have been doing my own library for Raspberry Pi, doing real-time audio on Raspberry Pi, and then solving some of the problems of getting lots and lots of remote Raspberry Pis that are on a Wi-Fi network to all play together and to be able to dynamically fine-tune and code them. So to overcome some of those challenges of being on site with everything set up, but not being constrained by what you can do at that moment, like being able to rapidly deploy code, being able to rapidly deploy new sounds and try stuff out and tweak it. So we did a lot of experimentation with physical, completely wireless devices, so battery powered, sensor-based things. And I had this amazing student, Ben, who was a complete self-taught everything, did all the fabrication himself. And it was also a boy enthusiast, like a circus performing enthusiast. So this has been doing some fun stuff with an interactive boy. And Ben actually far surpassed everything we were doing and did this amazing project, which actually won the. Oh, you must have met Ben because you were joint winners, joint third place or something in the Margaret Guthman Musical Instrument Award. And this is his poi that he developed. No, not poi, swirly stick. I don't know the technical term. I don't think he's been able to continue that work, which is a shame. But just some other related work. So I did some work with the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, looking at their mechanical musical instrument museum and incorporating some of my distributed devices into a work that reflected on mechanical musical instruments. With the Disclavia piano. I'm going to try and be time conscious, so I'm probably not going to play all of the video I've got. Mechanical drum patterns and stuff. And one of the things we were doing at that point was really incorporating Ableton Live into what we're doing as this sort of super versatile controller machine. So building Ableton Live devices that just sent OSC messages, and then developing our back end on the Raspberry Pis so that they were very, very versatile at the speed with which you could rig up a system over there and a controller over here. So for example, one of the things we've done in code is just, you can just put a function in into your program that's running on the remote device, and that will immediately appear as a variable that you can control in Ableton. So we developed a lot of that. And again, the focus of this is just how can we speed up that rapid creative process when you know that no matter how much work you do in the past, there's always that moment where you get on site and everything's actually finally in place, and you want to be able to tweak and you can't because there's so many obstacles. So we've been then iterating through a series of works. This was these are all part of our linkage project. This was at the Casula Powerhouse, and it's just a kind of riff on. This is not involving Squid Soup. It was during lockdown. The whole project was completely ruined by COVID stopping us actually collaborating with Squid Soup. But we did our own projects doing a sort of very Steve Reich inspired piece with lights and sound. 100 speakers, so very nice immersive experience when you go into it. And just to play one particular segment of that. No, that came later. But what was happening there was that all of the lights and speakers are playing pulses of sound and light according to a clock, but with a delay, and the delay is proportional to how far around the circle they are, but with a scaling variable. So we had like if you can imagine, just one MIDI controller, and you could turn up the scale or not. So when it's down to 0, they're all flashing time, and when it's up, they're all going around in circles. And just finding these sort of very simple paradigms of control were really key to thinking through that work and thinking through how you control multiples. So this work has also involved building a Unity simulator, where you can go and design your installation in any 3D modeling program you like, export it, load it into Unity and simulate it, and then also export from that all of the information that needs to be loaded onto the devices so they know where they are. So that, again, simplifies how quickly you can reconfigure an installation. And for this installation, actually, we started with a sphere as our concept. And as we started to work through the build constraints for that, we realized the sphere would be really hard because you have to have devices hanging underneath other devices. And we sort of workshopped that and developed a hemisphere with a hole in the middle so you could kind of stick your head into the hemisphere. And that was just an example where we'd already started doing all the coding and the development. So switching that design was an example where potentially you mess all of these other things up. And so that was a great case study of how quickly we can reconfigure. And things emerged like from that actually, like, you don't, in terms of the internal logic, you don't model this as a 3D object, you model it as a 2D surface, and that covers most of what you want to do aesthetically. So these are the kinds of things that have been emerging and just sort of being noted as creative practice paradigms, if you like. And this just sort of shows how, like, we've got a workflow where we've got code plus Ableton Live as a controller plus the 3D simulator. So it's sort of really speeding up what you can do. More models. So I'm going to jump ahead a bit because I don't want to go over time. There's a few other examples. We did stuff with live performers. And that was a bit of a revelation because we've always been working with Wi-Fi. And so we've always known that the latency of Wi-Fi is quite a major constraint on doing liveness. And what we found after playing with this stuff enough is that, yes, there's like a 40 to 100 millisecond delay, but loads of stuff is still possible with live music. And the reference point is always the organist in the church, who is actually so far away from the pipes that they also have a 40 to 100 millisecond delay. So if they can do it, we can. So we did this live performance in the Rocks last year, which Alan came to, and We worked with a series of musicians, and we also did some creative practice research. They were all completely new to the software. We were giving them an Ableton Live interface and saying, here, play with this. And they were rapidly sort of working out what they could actually do and developing works. So yeah, I'm just going to, just to quickly show the piece that's on in Melbourne. This is just my phone video. And it's really impossible to hear. All of these speakers are playing back recordings of beliefs, and the theatre company that did this have recorded thousands of beliefs. And the work, you have to come see it. The work involves these sort of tapestries of beliefs that sometimes merge and become one and sometimes break apart, and they're grouped according to themes and so on. So it's a really lovely interpretation of the kinds of things we've been trying to do. So wrapping up very, very quickly, all of this, I think when we started this project, we were much more fixated on just making a system that we could, put out there in the world. And over time, and due to some happenstance things like the developer on the project got another job and disappeared, and so we had to rehire, and we thought, well, let's not just keep spending money on development. Let's actually double down on the creative practice side of this and actually come out with, really focus on the knowledge outcomes that all of this work has done. So we focus much more on going back to thinking, basically, how do we report and explain what we've done in terms of theories of creative practice and all of the things we're looking at in terms of time, cost, and risk, and so on. So we're using a couple of really common reference points in creative practice theory, like the idea of creativity being a blind search process often. In other words, you can set out everything you want to do, but essentially you've got to engage in these moments where you don't know what you're going to do. But what you want to do is sort of lay out the conditions in front of you so that you can discover. So it's been a big driving force behind all of this work has been, how do we set the conditions where we can sit down with a system and very rapidly discover stuff that we didn't know. And many of the things I just showed you have all been discovered in the very last minute, or in happenstance ways. There's a whole history of work on creativity support tools, which frames this a little bit better. Coming up with design paradigms. You might have heard of wide walls, high ceilings, and low floors, and these are very common ways of thinking about what you're trying to do when you design creative tools, which are slightly different from designing other apps and software. And then some really interesting, slightly more recent work, like not that recent, but framing that in terms of how creative practitioners actually actively constrain what they're doing, because we all know, everyone says this, that constraints are one of the most powerful things you introduce. So wonderful idea from Doug House of decisive constraints that means artists are actually actively choosing their constraints so that they can then set aside stuff that they're not going to do and stuff that they are going to do. And we've developed that further into a concept of creative spaces in our work. So outlining how and at what points in our work we mark out a creative space as the thing where we're going to do the blind search, the exploratory search. So some of this work has dug into what type of practitioner are you, and categorizing, noting that there are very different approaches to this. So one of the things from an earlier paper, we kind of just conceptually worked through the distinction between what is a different creative practice stance with relation to technology. And I think basically noting that number 3 here is what actually a lot of people do, which is that they don't preconceive an idea and find the technology to implement it. They're constantly in a dialogic interaction with the potentials of technology. So show me some things that the system can do, and I'll go off and I'll create something within that space is a very standard creative technology scenario. In the work with the live musicians, we did this a bit more formally, and we identified 3 approaches that they take. Explorers who really embody that stance. They want to find out what the technology can do, and then they really want to find its kind of interesting edge points and niches. Stipulators are much more hands-off. They basically they're doing the same thing. They want to know what the technology can do, and then they'll see what they want to do with it. But they're much more like okay, I can see that it can do that. Let's have that. Or can you give me something that does this? And much less interested in the exploration and much more interested in pinning down an outcome from the start and just working in a very safe way. And adopters really listen to what the software can do and then think about how they're going to do something within that paradigm, but not in such an exploratory way. So this is a first attempt based on just a study of these 6 artists that we work with to pull this out. And we'd like to go deeper into this because we think this is pretty key, is like distinguishing types of creative user. And another thing we've been doing is a lot of like just time analysis of how much time you actually spend doing stuff. So this is from another earlier paper where we actually document all of the time we spend in different tasks, setting up devices, connecting to devices, in-depth coding, debugging, troubleshooting, rapid creative coding, etc. And noting that all of the good, fun, creative stuff is this stuff down here. So using that as a way to think about how any creative technology project can be divided up into creative work and boring, getting it done work. But then also noting that actually all of these things potentially feed in this sort of hybrid way into creative practice. And I'm really conscious of time, so I'm just going to stop there. I don't want to go over. There's a whole lot of papers. This is the one we're just publishing where Kurt went and did this ridiculously detailed timeline analysis using all of our GitHub sort of data and all of our email data and all of his own observational data to sort of try and thrash out how these ideas work in practice and identifying some of these moments like that, going from the sphere to the hemisphere and noting, how that then trickled down into all of these other design decisions and how it changed what we were doing. And how agile the whole system was, like how robust the whole system was as a whole for making those kinds of adaptations. So it's all work in progress. We're thinking now towards a book which might have co-authors or invited chapters in this area. So that's one of the final things I'm interested in talking about this work, is to reach out to people who might be interested in thinking along this framework. So thank you very much.
Is it time for questions?
Show you my massive collection of outtakes of failed submissions as well. Just eye candy in the background.
I didn't quite get the distinction between the 6 collaborated with more and the 6 artists in the way that you felt their relationship with them.
Yeah, so 2 were, and I mean, this does fall kind of along the lines of how much they were into coding and things like that. So 2 of them were very much like, wow, I want to dig into what the system can do. And they had an experimental music view on the world. Their general approach to music was in terms of experiments and eking out weirdnesses, as opposed to other artists who are, their paradigm was more about working in a certain musical style and developing that style and developing an identity and getting good at what you do. So there's a clear underlying, sort of where you're coming at this from. And so those experimenters were getting into the code, which is pretty essential to them doing that experimentation, but probably not completely necessary. But they wanted to find what was interesting. So they were quite conceptual. They wanted to find what was interesting about the system and tease it out, like sonically, but also conceptually, like the idea of having 100 samples all playing at once, or this sort of stuff. And then also how you could perform that live, because you really could, like, it's a very nice system. You can just say, like, give me 100 samples and filter sweep, and do some live stuff and have it all sync to beats that are coming out of the PA. And so we haven't got anywhere near exploring that. But yeah, like other artists were much more time poor. Like they were coming at it from, and there's so much context to this, of course. They're coming at it from, like, we have a live show, we know what we do it really well. We love the idea of some of the things you're telling us, but Here's what we want to do. We want to do this, this, and this. Let's have some flashing lights. Let's have the sound of the bass go whoosh, and one more thing, and that's kind of it. And then the ones in between were spent time exploring the GUI that we gave them and saying, how can I bring this into my live set? There's a little bit of both, but we called them adopters in the sense that they're sort of saying, you know, like if you bought a new synth from the shop, like what sounds does this make? Okay, I like that. I like that. Let me use a bit of that. So maybe it's actually more of a spectrum. We haven't, there's loads more to do.
Interesting you put them on that graph there with the two axes to the axis of the third one, I think.
Oh yeah, I forgot to explain the axes. Yeah, so I want the system to offer me new creative possibilities versus my creative work is already established. Just give me this as a layer on top, and I need the software to do something specific, or I can work with what this software does. So these are sort of two dimensions of adaptability to how you work with tech. So something I'd like to do in the longer term is look over much longer life cycles of creative practice, like particularly electronic musicians. How much time you invest in learning a tool, and then how much you take on board as you're learning it, like how much style. You know, people say like, you know, Ableton has a certain sound or Max has a certain sound. It's not just the sonics, it's actually like the way that people work. So there's a lot of casual sort of thinking around that. It'd be nice to look at longer scale, like when you go and do a Max course and learn Max, how much do you suddenly adopt the aesthetics of a Max practitioner in your work? And I think probably quite a lot.
Your creative practice comes to this installation. From my experience, I don't have that much experience with these installations, but I've been working on one of the things that has, found singles. And you mentioned that you had a lot of moments where you would see certain ridiculous moments. How much did they like? So when you have that idea, how clear is the idea that you start? And how much knowledge do you have before maybe this is a vague question away, but I don't know.
Yeah, this is like a slide from quite a long time ago when we started really thinking about this. And it was the observation with Squid Soup was that it looks like the timeline basically looks like this. Like the creative work is at the very beginning and the very end. And then in the middle, there's all this other stuff, which is not uncreative. It's very creative. And it can often feed in those kinds of ways. But basically, you do a whole lot of conceptual development. And usually, like ideally, at least for companies that are very used to pitching something to arts festivals and things, there's got to be this ridiculously clear mission statement, like a one-liner. So Murmuration, the Scottsdale work, was let's make a murmuration of birds metaphorically presented in light outside the museum, flying around the museum. You know, simple as that. And then all of the detail can be fleshed out. It's a decisive constraint as well.
So you do go blind.
Well, you've got that as your guiding principle, and you know that you're going to do something, but you just don't quite know what.
Yeah,
And sometimes you do completely throw that up and tear that up and throw it away, but not usually once someone's given you a large sum of money for the idea that you just pitched. So there are social constraints as well. But yeah, we know this is just a casual observation, which is sort of like the grounding for everything we're trying to test. Is like you do absolutely months and months of laborious technical work, and then finally you've got one day once you've set up and installed work, and very limited things you can do during that one day. Just like, does that sound okay? Turn it up a bit. Okay, great, done. So how do you shift this setup?
That would be my other question as well, like timeline. Is there how long would it take to work as one of the work? Like let's say the hospital.
Yeah.
How long would it take to shift?
Well, given that, yeah, I mean, given that so I was like, I play many different roles myself. Like sometimes I'm the artistic director, but for that one, I'm just the sound designer. I came in and just did the sound design, but working with these insane constraints, like I can only use 50 megabytes of audio, and I have to do 3 different scenes and all of this stuff. And I have no idea what they sound like until I get there on the day. But that took forever because that involved the entire R&D, fabrication, design, experimentation, electronics design, everything was all done for that project. So it was massive overinvestment by them in the anticipation that they would use it again. And Squid Soup generally they'll put blood, sweat, and tears into a project like that, and then they will just, common sense, they'll just try and milk that by running it here and there and everywhere. By the way, they're coming to Vivid in Sydney with a variation of this. But the nice thing is that you can, once you've done all the building, you set it up and you can just go and tweak the software. So obviously you can reprogram it quite easily. But it's interesting because they tend not to, because they're so burnt out having done all of the work that they just want to show it here, there, and everywhere.
I think you mentioned earlier that thinking on perspective research, and I was wondering how much that has informed your creative practice, but at the same time, your view of the researcher on these.
Did you say anthropological?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like something that comes and goes for me because I studied anthropology in my undergraduate, and then I did all other tech stuff and creative stuff. And so I've always been like kind of, I would say, anthropologically aware. And I mean, these things come up in design, like reflective practice and ethnographic methods in design and so on. But I've actually I wrote a blog post about this for an anthropology journal recently, just trying to capture that. Because when I referring to like earlier work with creative AI stuff, and the question was like, did I take an anthropological approach? And I would say, yeah, in some ways, but most importantly, not, because I wasn't engaged with questions of race and class and social hierarchies and things like that. So my work has been pretty politically light, and that is something I'm trying to change now, because I think it's just becoming increasingly important, especially with what's going on in AI. And I'm doing a bit of catch up, but I've been working with this amazing group of anthropologists looking at music and AI. So that's shifting. I just did a paper where I did a study of a bunch of music AI startup companies, looking at what are the factors driving them, what values are they trying to sell, and that's, for me, that was like a massive mental shift from creative practice. So how you do both, I'm not totally sure.
Is it fun?
No, it's in review, but I'm happy to send you a draft.
Yeah.
It'll go. Oh, okay. Goodbye.
Couldn't bear the sound.
The last question.
In the book published in Joseph very submissions.
Yeah.
So have you ever had to calculate the ratio of success?
Well, I'm useless at making money from commercialization, and I'm pretty useless at submitting arts pitches as well. I never got that from John. I don't know. I never got from you. It never filtered into me like how to get really successful arts commissions. So we've done a lot of like big.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, my trick is to work with Squid Soup, who get them all the time. But doing my own practice in the Interactive Media Lab is much harder. It's hard being an academic and getting that arts support.
And why do you think that? Like you did a concealer, for example, on us or that's something you decided to do because you felt like, okay, I've got a job at university.
That was
something for the community, so it doesn't have a huge budget.
Well, the two works we did at Casula were embedded in the linkage application. So Casula was a partner, and they came on board because they were interested in seeing how this technology might be used in all different kinds of installation contexts. And that didn't really come to fruition, but that was another COVID calamity was because they actually lost all of their technical team. So our main point of contact at Katsula, we were going to run workshops and teach all of their staff how to use the system and then deploy it in different contexts. And that just got wiped out with so much other stuff with COVID because they lost those staff and they're not doing very well. They're not being very well supported by their council. So it's a bit of a sad story for them. Thanks for having me, people.
All right, thank you, Ollie.